We're on 26A. Sorry for the delay.
Oh, what is impossible?
The whole team.
Okay, we're on 26A, about 3/4 of the way down the page at the 2 dots. First words in the line are Pshita. More than 3/4. Yep. Okay, so we learn in the Mishnah that a mamzer who's married to a mamzeres, which is a perfectly legitimate marriage. There's nothing wrong with that. A mamzer married to a mamzeres, the woman goes through the Sotah process. So the Gemara says, why wouldn't she? It's a legit. It's nothing wrong with a mamzer marrying a mamzeres. So the Gemara says, maybe because let's say she's innocent, what's going to happen is she will conceive. And we wouldn't want more mamzerim to exist. The child of this relationship is obviously a mamzer. So therefore she shouldn't drink. Kamash Malan, because the marriage is legal and there's nothing wrong with that. Therefore she's a regular woman and she goes through the Sotah process. H is Gera Evan Meshukra Islandess. The wife of the Gera or a slave who was freed, or an islandess, all these are legal marriages. Pshita, this is obvious. Ma'adatema, I would think Dabra B'nai Yisrael v'legerim, because the Torah says B'nai Yisrael, I would think it excludes gerim, converts. Kamash Malan, that the chiddush over here is that no, that even if you're a convert, you're also included in Sotah. Be'emachanami. Maybe we should exclude converts. Maybe actually that's the correct way to understand. The Gemara says, you're right. The fact that Torah says B'nai Yisrael, but then it says say it. It says tell the B'nai Yisrael and tell them. Who exactly are you telling if you've already told them? Most of the time it says Davar B'nai Yisrael. It doesn't say for Amarta Aleim. The Amarta Aleim includes also Gerim, converts. Ashes Kayan Shai. So the wife of the Kayan, she drinks. So the Gemara says, why would I think she doesn't drink? As follows. So in the 1 second. Yeah. So inside the parasha of Sotah, the Torah says that the woman was with another man, but she wasn't forced. It was not an instance of rape. If it was, then the woman is exempt from any penalty. However, that's not the case with the wife of a Kohen. Even if she was raped, she can no longer be with her husband. And therefore, perhaps as follows. I would think Pshita Ma'atem, I would think the Hilan is Basa Asura. If she wasn't forced, then she's prohibited. Hanes Basa, but if she was forced, Mutaras, she's permitted and she's not a Sotah. Since the wife of a Kohen, even if she's forced, she's still prohibited. I would think maybe she shouldn't drink. Kamash Malan, that whether or not she's forced is not a condition in Sotah. In other words, even if a woman is forced, obviously she's not a Sotah. And that would be the case whether she's permitted to her husband or whether she's prohibited to her husband. Permitted as in every marriage, except for Kohen, who's prohibited even in the case of force. But that doesn't exclude her from the general question of when she wasn't forced, that she undergoes a Sotah process. Are we together on this point? Muteris Labailo, and she's permitted. And okay, so now the wife of the Kohen, if she's a Sotah and she drinks, and she doesn't die, she's permitted to her husband. So Gemara says, Pshita, why would I think otherwise? It's where her condition's been degrading. So Gemara says, so if she's degrading, if her condition's degrading, then that's clearly an indication that she's guilty. So Gemara says, no, we're talking about Misnavna Derech Yivarim. So one of the ideas that we saw before, let's say a woman has a schus, she has a merit, and she doesn't end up dying from the waters. She eventually will die the same death, in the same manner. So her stomach will blow up and her thigh will fall, and that's how she'll die. Now, if a woman is clearly beginning to suffer in exactly this way, that's an indication that she's guilty. Let's say her head starts hurting, which is not part of the process. So then this is evidence that she's not guilty, or whatever. It's not evidence. It doesn't prove anything. Even if she were guilty, it wouldn't necessarily happen to her. So Gemara says, "Ma'atem, I would think perhaps the fact that she's other organs of her body are beginning to decrease their functionality is a sign that there was a relationship. But the reason why she didn't die, because this was by Einus, was with force. But with regard to a kohen, she should still be prohibited. Kamash Malan, that there's no reason to suspect this. The Gemara is offering a speculative reason here. In other words, because I would think that in addition to the regular method of how the water would find her guilty, meaning her stomach and it would affect her stomach and her thigh, there could also be it could also have an impact even if she wasn't guilty, because it was by force. It was by force. And how would that impact? What would the impact of the waters be? Other organs would start to hurt, or decrease their functionality, degrade. And therefore, I would think that the wife of the kohen, if that happens to her, that's an indication that she's prohibited to her husband. Kamash Malon, that there's no such idea. Either she's killed regularly, in other words, her stomach and her thigh, or nothing happens in the case where she's innocent. Ashes Sris Shaisa, the wife of a Sris drinks. Sris is unable to conceive. Pshita, this is obvious. I would think okay. Okay. The point here is that means that we learned that the adulterer, it has to be that the husband was with his wife before the adulterer was with her. Now, I would think maybe that there's something more. Means the husband has to be with her completely, meaning a sfir is someone who's sterile, who can't emit seeds, is not included in Mibalad Ishech. It's not possible for him to be with her in the same way that the adulterer could be with her.
How would they know he's sterile? I mean, I guess.
He's someone who's, this is going to be obviously someone who isn't.
Was it Petua Daka? Was that?
Yeah, Petua or someone who's obviously sterile. Petua would be in a different category, because Petua would be a forbidden relationship.
It wouldn't even be allowed to marry, right?
So Rashi discusses how exactly, some depends on how it became sterile, but there could be ways where he's sterile where the relationship would be permitted. Okay, Kamash Malan, that there's no requirement that he actually be able to emit seeds. In other words, the fact that he can be with her, the pasuk of Mibalad Ishech means besides for the husband, means that the husband has to be first, but it doesn't mean that the relationship has to be one that specifically has an emission. Okay. Ayidei kol arayis mekanin. The husband could give kinoi even to a man who is prohibited for other reasons. Gemara says pshito, that seems to be obvious. I would think I would think as follows. The Torah says that at the conclusion, if a woman is a saita, then she's prohibited to both her husband and to the adulterer. I would think that it has to be a person who she could become prohibited to. But in the case where she's prohibited anyway, because the man's her father, or her brother, etc., or her sister-in-law's wife, or something like that. I'm sorry, sister-in-law's husband. Then I would think that maybe he's already prohibited, so he doesn't become prohibited, and therefore he's not included in the category. Where he becomes prohibited through this action, through this activity. However, in a scenario where he's already prohibited because he's a relative, then maybe not. Kamash Malon, that he's still included and you can still give kinoi and he would remain prohibited. Chutz min hakoton, okay, so you can give kinoi with regard to any man, except for a koton, someone who's underage, and somebody who isn't a man. Who's that person who isn't a man? That's the Gemara wants to know. Okay, so first we'll start with the koton, underage. Ish Amar Achmanav like koton, it has to be a man, someone who's mature. But like koton and not a child. V'she'ena ish, who is the person who's not a man? The mi'ute mai, who's that coming to exclude? Ilema l'mi'ute shachov. Okay, what is a shachov? Shachov is somebody whose skin is sort of peeling and he's extremely weak. 1 second.
Talks about erections and
Yeah,
not being able
that's what I was trying to see. Where's it?
wait, right there.
Yeah, okay. This is a complicated one.
Which one is it?
Yeah. This is the complication. Okay. Yeah, this is the addressing the issue. Okay. So it goes as follows, just explain as follows. The halacha is as follows. The halacha is that if a man is completely impotent and cannot carry an erection, then his act of intercourse is not legally recognized. It's not halachically recognized. It has to be that the shachov, even though he's extremely weak, he has difficulty with carrying an erection, but he is able to achieve something to the point where his action would be legally recognized as an act of cohabitation. Okay. However,
He
forgot to take his Viagra before we.
the shachov, however, is certainly not able to have an emission.
Remember my standing
Seven-
warning.
Seminal emission. Yeah.
Precious bodily
This
fluids.
is a trigger warning. This is a trigger warning tomorrow for the rest of the day. Okay. Anyway, okay, so you're forewarned. Okay, so again, a shachov is someone who has difficulty carrying an erection and certainly cannot have a seminal emission because he's too weak. Okay, okay, so maybe we're talking about a shachov here, someone who's extremely ill. A shachov, you can warn him to stay away from your wife. You can warn your wife to stay away from him. And if a woman has a relationship with a shachov, then she becomes invalid to eat truma. What does this mean? The daughter of a Kohen eats truma unless she engages in a prohibited relationship. And if the shachov was prohibited to her, again, even though the shachov is someone who has difficulty maintaining an erection, other than for very short periods, she still becomes invalid to eat truma. So the Gemara says pshita. This seems to be obvious. I would think v'shachav ish oisa shichvas zera amar achmana. 1 second. When the Torah talks about a man who becomes the Torah talks about Sotah, it talks about a philanderer sleeping with the man's wife, and it talks about sleeping with her shichva zera, a laying of seeds. But this man cannot have an emission. Kamash Malon, that shichva zera is not a requirement. Not necessary for a man to actually have a seminal emission when in order for the woman to become a Sotah. So why does the Torah write it? We'll get to it. We'll get to that at the end. Okay, upaisel b'truma, and she becomes invalid to eat truma. Pshita, why would I think, in other words, she engaged in a prohibited, if presuming that this shachov is prohibited, it's a prohibited relationship. So Gemara says, I would think leichal zari amrachmana de islay zari lechol de less zari lechol kamash malan. In other words, because the relationship has the potential for the children to become invalids. 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Okay, no. In other words, we compare the relationship of a girl the daughter of a Kohen having a forbidden relationship with a Kohen marrying a forbidden relationship whose children become invalid. And the point of there is that there's potential for the children to be impacted by this relationship, but because the shachov cannot have a seminal emission, therefore there is no children involved. Maybe he should be excluded. Kamash Malon, that no, the exclusion for what a kohen is allowed to marry is different, could be different than what a kohenes, an affair that would render a kohenes invalid to eat truma. Okay, the elamut. So the Gemara says the person who's not a man is talking about a non-Jew. The Gemara says you could warn a person could warn his wife to stay away from a non-Jew. And also a non-Jew will invalidate a kohenes to eat truma. You can warn a person can warn his wife to stay away from a non-Jew. Obviously, I would think it says that the adulterer will become prohibited. Maybe I would think where he becomes prohibited through this act of adultery. Just like we saw this previously with regard to a forbidden relationship, this would be true of a non-Jew as well. Because a non-Jew is a prohibited relationship anyway. So therefore, I would think maybe maybe you can't war a non-Jew doesn't prohibit a woman in the process of Sotah. Mashmalan that no, even though he doesn't become prohibited after being with a woman, because he's already prohibited, she is still included in the category of Sotah. He becomes he may if a kohenes has a relationship with a non-Jew, she can no longer eat truma. Shita, this seems to be obvious. When a kohenes gets married, right, then she loses her ability to eat truma. If she doesn't get married, but she has a relationship with a kosher man, then she's still allowed to eat truma.
Somebody that would have been permitted to.
Someone who would have been permitted.
An adulterous relationship?
Extramarital, not extra, non-marital. Non-marital relationship with a Yisrael would not render her invalid to eat truma. Okay, now, since when she does get married, she has to marry somebody who she's able to have a marital relationship with. And like we said before, you can't marry a non-Jew. There's no such thing. There's no framework of marriage that exists. And therefore, I would think that just like when she gets married, she has to marry somebody who she could marry, obviously, because otherwise you can't have a marriage with somebody you can't marry. You can't marry a sister, you can't marry a non-Jew either. There's no framework of Kedushin. So therefore, I would think that similarly, if she has a non-marital relationship, it has to be a non-marital relationship that's forbidden with someone who she could marry. What's an example of that? This would be mamzeres, right? Yisrael marrying a mamzeres. There can be a legal framework of marriage, even though the relationship is prohibited. But maybe it doesn't include a relationship that doesn't have a marriage at all. For example, let's say she marries her brother or father or son or a non-Jew, because none of those relationships can have the marital framework. So Kamash Malon that no, that Kamash Malon that in terms of her becoming invalid to eat truma, even if the relationship is forbidden and does not have a marital framework, it also renders her invalid to eat truma. Like Rabbi Yehudah taught. Rabbi Yehudah said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, how do we know that if a non-Jew marries a kohenes, they can no longer eat truma? Shenever Bas Kain Kisia or if it's a Levi or Yisrael, she's no longer allowed to marry a Kain. Bas Kain Kisia Almon Ugrusha. 1 second. Okay, when we talk about if you have a daughter of a Kohen that gets married, legal kosher marriage, and then does not have children and gets divorced or her husband dies, she goes back to her father's house. She can eat truma. Specifically, if the relationship was of the type that you can have a divorce or a widow, meaning it was a legal marriage. But if the relationship was a forbidden relationship that has no framework of marriage either, then she's invalid to return to her father's house and eat truma, meaning she's prohibited to eat truma. Okay, fine. Okay, point being that who is the person that's not a man? It's not a shachov, right? Shachov is a very ill person, does not have a seminal mission, but can carry an erection for a short period of time, and it is not a non-Jew. In both instances, a person can warn his wife of these people, and
Okay, Rabbi, I stop you there, okay? And I warn you, stop bringing Native Americans into this. It's offensive. Okay? Stop criticizing the Seminoles, all right?
okay. Okay. So both a non-Jew and a shachov, a person can warn his wife to stay away from them, and they would render his wife a saita. Okay, so what are we talking about? A person cannot warn his wife not to sleep with an animal. So the Gemara says the ain's nus behema, because even though a relationship with an animal is an act that qualifies for capital punishment,
It turns left and it hits you and you're not expecting it.
even though a relationship with an animal is an absolutely prohibited relationship. However, it's not considered a relationship of snus. It doesn't have the title of snus. Okay. So Rava from Frazikya asked Rav Ashi, how do we know this? The Torah says there's a prohibition to bring as a sacrifice if a man hires a prostitute and gives her an animal, and that animal would otherwise be fit for sacrifice. So it's an ox, it's a bull, or it's a ram, or sheep, or a cow. Okay, or he trades a sheep for a dog. So that sheep is also prohibited as a korban. You're not allowed to bring the sheep. Okay. The Tanya we learn. Esnan. So again, Esnan Zayin is the gift, is the payment to a prostitute. Umechir Kelav is what's swapped for a dog. What happens if you switch them around? You have Esnan Kelav. He gives a sheep to a prostitute to have her sleep with a dog. Or Umechir Zaina. He has a maidservant who is a known prostitute, and he switches the maidservant he trades her for a sheep. Right? In both of these cases, mutarim, that animal, that sheep is permitted. Shenemar gam shneim, specifically the gift that's given to a prostitute in exchange for znus, for an immoral affair, and the sheep that's exchanged for a dog. Shenemar gam shneim. These specific two, shnayim v'le'arba, it's two categories, not four. Okay, evidently from here we see that the relationship between a woman and an animal is not considered znus. And it's a prohibited relationship, but it's not called znus, and therefore he can't warn his wife to stay away from animals.
Isn't there a death penalty for that?
Correct. It's a severe violation.
Yeah.
It's not called znus. Ve'ela shichva zera lamali. Okay, now the question is, if we're talking here about a man, a shachov, who clearly is not able to have a seminal emission, so then why does the Torah say shechva zera? We're talking about a seminal emission. So Gemara says, we need it for this price, shechva zera, prat l'dover achar. It excludes something else. Okay, so in other words, you can't warn your wife for something else. What is something else? What exactly is this? if he warns his wife the unusual manner. Again, this is a very specific reference. It's a reference to anal sex here. In other words, that the unusual manner is considered no different than the regular manner, and they're both in the same category, and therefore there's no need for a pasuk to specifically exclude it. I'm sorry. Now, on that, moreover, it isn't excluded. That is also prohibited. A man is able to warn his wife of such a thing. It's the same. It's effectively the same thing. It's where a woman was I don't know what the technical English word is, but basically they're sleeping together even if they're not cohabiting with each other. Abaye says, so this is it's very promiscuous and wrong behavior, but it's not an act of znus. Znus would be a carnal act of cohabitation, but there's nothing carnal about them sleeping together. Sleeping together meaning in a very literal sense, without cohabitation, not in a euphemistic sense.
But they could be in contact.
Touching each other. They're touching each other, but they're not doing anything that would qualify as a legal act of carnal cohabitation. I'll define that in a moment. We'll define exactly what cohabitation is in a moment.
Like Abishag
That would be, that certainly could be that guy. I'm sure. Okay, so the Gemara says, well, Avishag was permitted to do it, but another situation. Another situation. So the Gemara says, in other words, so why would I need to exclude it? It's not, if it's not carnal in the legal sense of being an act of cohabitation, why would I think that you would be able to warn your wife to stay away from it? Now, obviously, this is prohibited anyway, but it wouldn't qualify for Sotah. Right, this is in the category of a person that has to stay away from prohibited relationships, and obviously, sleeping with somebody else, skin contact would not qualify as permitted under staying away from a prohibited relationship. Obviously, the man who she's in touch with, in contact with, is not prohibited to her, and the behavior is prohibited, but it's not carnal in a sense to become a Sotah. Okay, so Abaye says we're talking about we're neshika literally means to kiss. Over here it means to touch. So it means where both of their genitalia touch, but there's no penetration. Okay, so now here is the fundamental question, which we addressed a few times in Yivamis previously, which is how do you define the carnal nature of cohabitation? So the definition the Torah says is what's called hara. Now, what is hara?
That's in the last hurrah.
They
have sweets along with this. Is it like carnal candy here?
This would be the case. If you define the legal carnal nature of cohabitation as achnasa Torah, meaning penetration, so then that makes sense that avon l'shika v'lo klum. So that means the Torah would say that you can to warn her. In other words, if she's been with the man but only been in contact, even in obviously with both of their genitalias, but there was no penetration, so that does not qualify her as a Sotah. However, and moreover, it doesn't qualify as a warning. You have to warn her to stay away from carnal cohabitation and not this type of thing. Now, obviously, this is clearly prohibited, not permitted behavior, but it wouldn't qualify as a warning of Sotah. Okay, so that makes sense.
Would that be allowed or anywhere?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a lot of chokas harayas. So he's obviously doing something that's almost the act of carnal activity.
Right.
Okay. So this makes sense. In other words, cohabitation is defined by penetration, and just touching without penetrating, that would be considered hara. That would be excluded. Okay, that makes sense. However, the next category is difficult. Touching. That's excluded in the warning of a Sotah. According to the opinion that says hara is touching. In other words, penetration is not required for a carnal act. Just the fact that their genitalia are touching in that area is sufficient to is sufficient to be called carnal. So then obviously he could warn his wife. So Michael Maimer. So the Gemara says, "Alam shekino darchei varim." Talking about where a husband warned his wife not to sleep next to, in a very literal sense, somebody else. I would think perhaps the Torah allows him to warn any type of promiscuous behavior, even one that isn't carnal. And this guy doesn't want his wife to lay this way, obviously. So Kamash Malon, that no, even though the husband obviously doesn't want it, and then he warns his wife this way, it doesn't qualify as a warning. The warning is stay away from carnal activity.
Huh.
Okay.
Subtle difference here.
It's not gonna. Okay. Have a great day. Sorry for